The autumn rain drummed against the windows of the Salem Historical Society, with an insistent rhythm that seemed to echo the turning of dusty pages. Dr. Rebecca Morrison adjusted her wire-rimmed glasses and squinted at the collection of daguerreotypes spread across the mahogany table before her. The musty scent of old paper and leather bindings filled the archive room, a smell that had become as familiar to her as her morning coffee. "Another late night, Rebecca," called Margaret Chen, the Society's elderly archivist, as she gathered her coat from the nearby chair. "You know these old photographs aren't going anywhere." Rebecca looked up from her work, brushing a strand of auburn hair from her face. "I know, Margaret, but there's something about this particular collection that keeps drawing me back. The Whitmore estate donation has some fascinating pieces from the 1890s. Margaret paused at the doorway, her expression growing thoughtful. "The Whitmore family, now there's a name I haven't heard in years. Tragic story, that one. 2 young children disappeared without a trace back in 1898, never found so much as a button from their clothes." A chill ran down Rebecca's spine, though she attributed it to the drafty old building. "Disappeared? I hadn't come across that information in my research." "Oh yes, it was quite the scandal at the time. Thomas and Eleanor, I believe their names were. Twins, about 8 years old. One day they were there, the next." Margaret shrugged sadly. "The parents searched for months, offered rewards, had the whole town looking. Nothing ever came of it." After Margaret left, Rebecca found herself drawn back to the photographs with renewed interest. She carefully examined each daguerreotype, noting the formal poses typical of the era, the stiff Victorian clothing, and the serious expressions that came from having to remain motionless during the long exposure times. Then she found it. The photograph was slightly larger than the others, mounted in an ornate silver frame that had tarnished with age. The image showed 2 young children standing beside what appeared to be their grandparents in front of a modest Victorian home. The twins were perhaps 7 or 8 years old, with pale faces and dark, serious eyes. The boy wore a small suit with a bow tie, while the girl was dressed in a white dress with lace trim, but it was the elderly couple that made Rebecca pause. There was something unsettling about them, though she couldn't immediately place what it was. The man was tall and gaunt, with deep-set eyes and a severe expression. The woman beside him was smaller, with silver hair pulled back tightly, and a smile that seemed forced, almost predatory. Rebecca turned the photograph over and found an inscription in faded ink. "Thomas and Eleanor Whitmore with their loving grandparents, September 1898. These had to be the same children Margaret had mentioned. Rebecca felt a pang of sadness, knowing that within weeks of this photograph being taken, these 2 innocent faces would vanish forever. She decided to use the Society's new digital enhancement equipment to get a better look at the details in the photograph. The technology was still relatively new to their small historical society, but it had already proven invaluable in uncovering details invisible to the naked eye. As the high-resolution scan appeared on her computer screen, Rebecca leaned forward, fascinated by the clarity the digital enhancement provided. She could see the intricate details of the children's clothing, the texture of the wooden siding on the house, even individual leaves on the elm tree in the background. Then she zoomed in on the faces of the grandparents, and her blood turned to ice. The man's eyes, which had appeared merely stern in the original photograph, now revealed themselves to be completely black, as if they contained no pupils at all. But more disturbing was the woman's smile. What had seemed like a forced expression now looked distinctly malevolent, her lips curved in a way that suggested she was savoring some private, terrible joke. Rebecca sat back in her chair, her heart pounding. The enhancement software sometimes created artifacts or distortions, she reminded herself. Digital scans weren't perfect, especially with photographs this old, but as she continued to study the image, another detail caught her attention. In the window of the house behind the family, barely visible in the shadows, was another face, a child's face, pressed against the glass from inside, mouth open as if screaming. Rebecca's hands trembled as she reached for her notebook. This couldn't be real. It had to be a trick of light and shadow, or a flaw in the digitization process, but the more she looked, the more certain she became that what she was seeing was genuine. Thunder rumbled overhead as the storm intensified, and the lights in the archive room flickered momentarily. In that brief instant of darkness, Rebecca could have sworn she heard something that made her blood freeze. The sound of children crying, faint and distant, as if coming from very far away. When the light steadied, she was alone in the room with the photographs, and a growing sense that she had stumbled upon something far more sinister than a simple family portrait, something that should have remained buried with the past. Rebecca arrived at the Salem Historical Society the next morning, with dark circles under her eyes and a thermos full of strong coffee. Sleep had eluded her completely after what she had witnessed in the photograph. Every time she closed her eyes, she could see those black, empty eye sockets staring back at her, and that terrible smile that seemed to hide unspeakable secrets. The archive room felt different in the morning light, less oppressive, more mundane, but the photograph still lay on the table where she had left it, and in the daylight, her discoveries from the previous evening seemed almost ridiculous. Digital artifacts, she told herself again, tricks of light and shadow. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to uncover. Rebecca spent the morning systematically going through the rest of the Whitmore estate donation, looking for any other photographs that might provide context or clues about the family. Most were typical Victorian portraits, stiff, formal poses of various family members at different ages. But as she worked her way through the collection, she began to notice something strange. There were other photographs of children with the same elderly couple. The first was a tintype from what appeared to be the 1880s, showing 3 young boys standing beside the same tall, gaunt man and silver-haired woman. The boys looked to be between 6 and 10 years old, dressed in the typical clothing of the era. But when Rebecca examined the faces of the elderly couple, they looked exactly the same as they had in the 1898 photograph with the Whitmore twins. Not similar, identical. Her hands shaking slightly, Rebecca pulled out her magnifying glass for a closer look. The man's severe features, the woman's tight smile, they were precisely the same, down to every line and wrinkle, or rather, the complete lack of wrinkles. For people who would have been in their 80s in the 1880s photograph and nearly 100 in the 1898 one, their faces showed no signs of aging whatsoever. Rebecca's coffee grew cold as she dove deeper into the archives, pulling boxes from other collections, searching for any photographs that might feature the mysterious couple. What she found made her stomach turn. A cabinet card from 1875 showed twin girls, perhaps 9 years old, standing beside the same figures. A daguerreotype from 1883 featured a single boy, no more than 7, positioned between them in front of yet another Victorian home. Each photograph showed the couple looking exactly the same, ageless, unchanging, wearing clothes appropriate to each era, but faces that defied the passage of time. But it was the children's expressions that disturbed Rebecca the most. In every photograph, without exception, the children looked terrified. Their eyes held a kind of desperate pleading, as if they were trying to communicate some urgent message through the camera lens. Some had tears visible on their cheeks. Others had their small hands clenched into fists at their sides. Rebecca created a timeline on her laptop, documenting each photograph by date and location. The pattern that emerged was chilling. The photographs spanned nearly 30 years, from 1873 to 1901, taken in various towns throughout Massachusetts and New Hampshire. Always the same couple, always with children who appeared to be between the ages of 6 and 10. And according to the inscriptions on the backs, these were always identified as grandparents with their beloved grandchildren. But no grandparents could remain unchanged for 3 decades. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen across the archive room, Rebecca decided to research the locations mentioned in the photographs. Using the Society's genealogical databases and historical records, she began tracing what had happened to the families in each image. What she discovered made her blood run cold. In every single case, the children in the photographs had disappeared within weeks of the pictures being taken. Not just missing, completely vanished without a trace, as if they had never existed at all. No bodies were ever found. No ransom notes were ever received. The children simply stopped being. The boy from 1883, Jonathan Hayes from Concord, New Hampshire, vanished October 15, 1883, 3 days after his photograph was taken. The twin girls from 1875, Sarah and Mary Campbell from Marblehead, Massachusetts, last seen October 12, 1875. The photograph was dated October 9th. The 3 boys from the 1880s, the Morrison brothers from Newburyport, gone without a trace in late September 1887, just weeks after posing for what their parents thought would be a treasured family photograph. Thomas and Eleanor Whitmore, vanished October 3, 1898. Rebecca noticed another pattern that made her skin crawl. Every disappearance had occurred in October, and all within a 2-week period between the 1st and 15th of the month. As she sat surrounded by the evidence of decades of missing children, Rebecca felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn weather outside. These weren't random disappearances. They were systematic, planned, and somehow, impossibly, they were all connected to the same ageless couple who appeared in photograph after photograph, collecting children like trophies. The lights in the archive room flickered again, and Rebecca looked up nervously. The building was old, she reminded herself. The electrical system was probably just acting up due to the storm that had been brewing all day. But as she looked back down at the photographs spread across the table, she noticed something that hadn't been there before. The most recent photograph she had been examining, the one of the Morrison brothers from 1887, now showed something different in the background. There, barely visible in the shadows behind the house, was the outline of more children, dozens of them, their faces pale and indistinct, pressed against windows and standing in doorways, all staring directly at the camera with expressions of absolute terror. And they seemed to be reaching toward her through the photograph, their mouths open in silent screams that she could almost hear echoing through the decades. Rebecca stumbled backward from the table, knocking over her chair in the process. The crash echoed through the empty archive room like a gunshot, and the sudden noise snapped her back to reality. She stood there, breathing heavily, staring at the photographs that now seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. This wasn't possible. Photographs didn't change. They were static captures of single moments in time. But as she cautiously approached the table again, the additional figures in the shadows remained clearly visible, their ghostly forms seeming to shift slightly whenever she wasn't looking directly at them. Rebecca's academic mind fought against what her eyes were telling her. She had spent 15 years studying historical photography, analyzing thousands of images from the 19th and early 20th centuries. She knew every trick of light, every common flaw in the development process, every way that age and deterioration could distort an image. This was none of those things. With trembling fingers, she picked up her phone and took several pictures of the photographs, making sure to capture the shadowy figures that now populated the backgrounds. If she was losing her mind, at least she would have documentation of her descent into madness. As she reviewed the images on her phone screen, her heart nearly stopped. The ghostly children were visible in the digital copies as well, their faces becoming clearer with each photograph she took. They were all young, all dressed in period-appropriate clothing from different eras, and all bore expressions of absolute terror. But there was something else, something that made Rebecca's blood turn to ice. In the very back of one photograph, barely visible among the crowd of spectral children, she could make out two familiar faces, a boy and a girl, perhaps 8 years old, standing side by side with their arms around each other. Thomas and Eleanor Whitmore, the twins who had disappeared in 1898, were somehow present in a photograph taken in 1887, 11 years before they were even born. Rebecca sank into the chair she had knocked over, her mind reeling. Nothing about this made sense according to any rational understanding of reality, but the evidence was right there in front of her, captured not just in the original daguerreotypes, but in her own digital photographs taken moments ago. She needed help. This was beyond her expertise, beyond anything she had ever encountered in her academic career. But who could she possibly call? Who would believe what she was seeing? As if in answer to her thoughts, her phone rang. The caller ID showed Margaret Chen's number. "Rebecca?" Margaret's voice sounded strained, worried. "I hope I'm not disturbing you, but I couldn't stop thinking about our conversation yesterday regarding the Whitmore family. I went home and did some digging through my grandmother's old papers. Margaret, I'm glad you called. I've discovered something incredibly strange about those photographs, and I could really use another perspective. That's actually why I'm calling, dear. My grandmother lived in Salem her entire life, and she kept detailed journals about local families and events. I found several entries about the Whitmore disappearance, but also something much more disturbing." Rebecca gripped the phone tighter. "What did you find?" According to her journals, the Whitmore children weren't the first to vanish under similar circumstances. She wrote about a pattern stretching back decades. Children disappearing after having their photographs taken, with a mysterious elderly couple who claimed to be traveling photographers specializing in family portraits. The room seemed to grow colder as Margaret continued. "But here's the truly unsettling part, Rebecca. My grandmother described the couple, and her description matches perfectly with what I remember seeing in some of the older photographs in our collection. She called them the collectors, and wrote that they appeared to be the same age in 1920 as they had been in 1875. Rebecca's throat felt dry. "Margaret, I need you to come back to the society. Tonight, I have something to show you that will confirm everything your grandmother suspected and more. I was hoping you'd say that. I'm already in my car. I'll be there in 20 minutes. After Margaret hung up, Rebecca sat alone in the archive room, surrounded by the evidence of decades of missing children. The photographs seemed to watch her from the table, and she could swear she heard faint whispers coming from them, too soft to make out individual words but carrying an unmistakable tone of warning. She began to carefully examine each photograph again, looking for any clues she might have missed. In the 1875 image of the Campbell twins, she noticed something she hadn't seen before. The man's coat had a distinctive pin on the lapel, a small silver emblem in the shape of a camera with what appeared to be symbols etched around its edges. Using her magnifying glass, Rebecca studied the pin more closely. The symbols weren't random decorations. They were letters, but not in any alphabet she recognized. They seemed to shift and move as she looked at them, rearranging themselves into different patterns. But in the moment when the archive room lights flickered again, the symbols became briefly clear, spelling out words in English that made her soul freeze, captured forever. When the light steadied, the words had returned to their incomprehensible script, but Rebecca had seen enough. She knew now that she wasn't dealing with simple historical photographs. She was looking at something far more sinister, evidence of a supernatural force that had been preying on children for over a century. And based on the way the ghostly children in the photographs seemed to be reaching toward her, she suspected that her discovery had not gone unnoticed by the collectors themselves. Outside, storm clouds gathered with unnatural speed, blocking out the late afternoon sun and plunging the building into an early twilight. Thunder rumbled overhead, but it sounded different now, less like a natural weather phenomenon and more like the distant sound of an old camera shutter clicking repeatedly. Click, click, click. Rebecca realized with growing horror that the collectors might not be content to remain trapped in photographs from the past. They might be preparing to add new images to their collection, and she had a terrible feeling that she had just become their next target. Margaret Chen arrived at the Salem Historical Society just as the first drops of rain began to fall. The elderly archivist moved with surprising urgency, clutching a weathered leather satchel against her chest as she hurried through the front entrance. Rebecca met her at the archive room door, noting the pale complexion and worried expression on Margaret's usually serene face. "Rebecca, thank goodness you're still here," Margaret said, slightly out of breath. "After I called you, I found something else in my grandmother's papers, something that changes everything we thought we knew about the collectors." Rebecca ushered Margaret to the table where the photographs were still spread out. "Before you show me what you found, I need you to look at these images and tell me if you see anything unusual." Margaret set down her satchel and approached the photographs cautiously. She had worked with historical documents for over 30 years, but something about the collection on the table made her visibly uncomfortable. She picked up her own magnifying glass and began examining the images systematically. "My God," she whispered after several minutes of careful study. "Rebecca, do you see those figures in the shadows? The children in the backgrounds? You can see them too." Rebecca felt a wave of relief mixed with terror. At least she wasn't losing her mind. "How is this possible?" Margaret's voice was barely audible. "These children, they weren't in these photographs yesterday. I would have noticed something like this." Rebecca showed Margaret the timeline she had created and explained her discovery about the pattern of disappearances. With each detail, Margaret's expression grew more grave. When Rebecca finished, the older woman sat heavily in a nearby chair, her hands trembling slightly. "This confirms my worst fears," Margaret said finally. "Rebecca, my grandmother didn't just write about the collectors in her journals. She actually encountered them." Margaret opened her leather satchel and withdrew a small, leather-bound diary that looked to be over a century old. The pages were yellowed with age, and the ink had faded to a sepia brown, but the handwriting was still clearly legible. "My grandmother was Emily Chen, and she was 8 years old in October of 1899. According to her journal, which she started writing years later, she was supposed to be the next victim." Rebecca leaned forward, listening intently as Margaret began to read from the diary. "October 10th, 1920. I can finally write about what happened 21 years ago, though the memories still wake me in cold sweats. The man and woman came to our house on Chestnut Street, claiming to be traveling photographers. They said they specialized in family portraits and had heard we had beautiful children. My parents were flattered and agreed to have our pictures taken." Margaret's voice wavered as she continued reading. "They set up their camera equipment in our parlor, and something about the apparatus seemed wrong. The camera was much larger than it should have been, and it seemed to hum with an energy that made the hair on my arms stand up. But it was their eyes that frightened me most. They were completely black, like looking into deep wells. Rebecca felt chills run down her spine as Margaret read on. The woman kept smiling at me, but it was the kind of smile a cat gives a mouse before the kill. When they positioned me in front of the camera, I heard something that made my blood freeze. From inside the camera itself came the sound of children crying, faint but unmistakable. When I tried to tell my parents, they couldn't hear it. Margaret paused, her own hands now shaking as she held the diary. The man was adjusting the camera when my baby brother started crying upstairs. My mother went to tend to him, and my father stepped outside to close the shutters against the approaching storm. For just a moment I was alone with them. "What happened?" Rebecca whispered. The woman leaned down and whispered in my ear, "Soon you'll join the others, little one. Forever young, forever captured." But then something extraordinary occurred. My grandmother's cat, a large tom named Midnight, came into the room and began hissing and spitting at the camera equipment. The animal went absolutely wild, knocking over their tripod and clawing at the camera itself. Margaret turned the page and continued reading. In the chaos, I saw something that has haunted me ever since. When the camera fell, its front panel cracked open, and I could see inside. There were faces in there, Rebecca. Dozens of children's faces, all pressed against what looked like glass from the inside, their mouths open in silent screams. They were reaching toward me, trying to warn me. My parents returned just as the collectors were packing up their damaged equipment. They claimed they would return another day to complete the portrait, but they never did. 3 days later, I heard that they had visited the Morrison family on the other side of town. The Morrison's daughter, little Catherine, disappeared that very same night. Margaret closed the diary and looked directly at Rebecca. My grandmother spent the rest of her life researching the collectors. She believed they were some kind of supernatural entity that fed on the life essence of children, trapping their souls inside cursed photographic equipment. Thunder crashed overhead, and both women jumped. The lights in the archive room flickered more violently than before, and in the brief moments of darkness, Rebecca could swear she heard the sound Margaret's grandmother had described, children crying from somewhere far away. "Margaret," Rebecca said slowly, "your grandmother survived because the camera was damaged. But what if they've repaired it? What if they're still out there?" As if in answer to her question, a new photograph appeared on the table between them. Neither woman had placed it there. It was a modern instant photograph, the kind produced by old Polaroid cameras, and it showed the archive room they were sitting in at that very moment. But in the photograph, 2 additional figures stood behind their chairs, the same tall, gaunt man and silver-haired woman from the historical images, their black eyes staring directly at the camera with expressions of malevolent satisfaction. At the bottom of the photograph, written in spidery handwriting that seemed to move across the surface, were the words, "Time for a new collection." The temperature in the room dropped suddenly, and their breath became visible in the frigid air. From somewhere in the building came the distinct sound of an old camera being set up, the scraping of a tripod against the floor, the mechanical whir of vintage equipment being prepared. The collectors had found them. And this time there was no cat to knock over their cursed camera. Rebecca grabbed Margaret's arm, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. "We need to get out of here, now." But as they moved toward the archive room door, they found their path blocked. The door, which had been open moments before, was now firmly closed. Rebecca twisted the handle desperately, but it wouldn't budge. The metal felt ice cold beneath her fingers, so cold that it almost burned. "The windows," Margaret whispered, but when they turned to look, the windows had been covered by what appeared to be old photographic plates, blocking out all natural light. The room was now illuminated only by the flickering overhead fluorescence, which cast eerie dancing shadows across the walls. The sound of the camera equipment being assembled grew louder, closer. It seemed to be coming from multiple directions at once. The hallway outside, the basement below, even the floor above them. The mechanical clicking and whirring echoed through the building like some monstrous heartbeat. Rebecca's phone had no signal. Margaret tried hers with the same result. They were completely cut off from the outside world. "Listen," Margaret said suddenly, grabbing Rebecca's shoulder. "Do you hear that?" Beneath the sound of the camera equipment, they could now make out voices, dozens of children's voices, all whispering urgently. The words were indistinct, but the tone was unmistakable. They were trying to warn them. Rebecca looked back at the photographs on the table and gasped. The ghostly children in the backgrounds were no longer static. They were moving, gesturing frantically, their mouths forming words that the two women couldn't quite hear but somehow understood. "Run," the phantom children seemed to be saying. "Hide. Don't let them take your picture." But there was nowhere to run. The archive room had become a trap. A new sound joined the cacophony, footsteps in the hallway outside. Slow, deliberate, purposeful. Two sets of feet moving in perfect synchronization like a funeral march. They stopped directly outside the door. The door handle began to turn. Rebecca and Margaret pressed themselves against the far wall, clutching each other in terror. The door swung open with a creak that seemed to last forever, and two figures stepped into the room. The collectors looked exactly as they had in all the photographs, unchanged by the passage of more than a century. The man was tall and skeletal, wearing a black Victorian suit that seemed to absorb light. The woman was smaller but no less terrifying, her silver hair pulled back severely, and her lips curved in that same predatory smile Rebecca had seen in the enhanced photographs. But it was their eyes that truly horrified her. They weren't just black, they were voids, empty spaces where eyes should be that seemed to pull light and warmth from the room itself. "Dr. Rebecca Morrison," the woman spoke in a voice like rustling autumn leaves, "we've been watching your work with great interest. Such dedication to historical photography, such attention to detail." The man stepped forward, and Rebecca noticed he was carrying an ornate camera that seemed far too large and complex for any technology from the 1890s. It was covered in strange symbols that hurt to look at directly, and from within its depths came the faint but unmistakable sound of children sobbing. "You've seen our collection," the man said in a voice that seemed to come from very far away. "All those beautiful children, preserved forever in their perfect moment, never growing old, never changing, never leaving us." Margaret found her voice despite her terror. "My grandmother escaped you. She lived a full life. You can't have everyone." The woman's smile widened, revealing teeth that were far too sharp and far too numerous for any human mouth. "Ah, little Emily Chen's granddaughter. We remember her, the one that got away. We've been waiting so patiently for another chance at that bloodline. But first," the man continued, setting up his terrible camera with practiced efficiency, "we must complete our newest acquisition. Dr. Morrison has been so helpful in organizing our collection, cataloging our work. It's only fitting that she should join it permanently." The camera lens seemed to grow larger as he adjusted it, and Rebecca could see movement within its depths. Faces pressed against the inner surface of the lens, dozens of children all reaching toward her, their expressions a mixture of terror and desperate longing. "Don't look directly into the lens," Margaret whispered urgently. "My grandmother wrote, 'That's how they capture you,' but it was becoming increasingly difficult to look anywhere else. The camera exerted a strange pull, like a powerful magnet drawing her gaze. She could feel her will beginning to weaken, her feet starting to move forward against her conscious desire. "That's right," the woman cooed. "Just step into position. It will all be over so quickly, and then you'll be with us forever. Forever young, forever ours." Rebecca fought against the compulsion, but her academic mind was failing her. This was beyond reason, beyond any rational response. The supernatural force emanating from the camera was overwhelming her ability to resist. Just as she was about to step into the frame, Margaret did something unexpected. She grabbed one of the historical photographs from the table, the original 1898 image of the Whitmore twins, and hurled it directly at the camera. The moment the photograph made contact with the cursed device, several things happened at once. A brilliant flash of light filled the room, temporarily blinding everyone present. The sound of children's voices rose to a deafening crescendo. And most importantly, Rebecca felt the compulsion break, her will returning to her own control. "The photographs!" Margaret shouted over the supernatural chaos. "They're anchors! The children are trapped in the photographs!" Rebecca understood immediately. If the children's souls were imprisoned in the photographic images, then those same images might be the key to fighting back against the collectors. She began grabbing photographs from the table, and as each one touched the cursed camera, the screaming from within grew louder, and the collectors' forms seemed to waver and fade slightly. But their victory was short-lived. The man raised his hand, and Rebecca found herself frozen in place, unable to move or speak. The woman's laughter filled the room like the sound of breaking glass. "Clever," she hissed, "but ultimately futile. You cannot destroy what has already been destroyed. You cannot free what has chosen to stay." The camera lens began to glow with an inner light that seemed to pull at Rebecca's very soul, and she realized with growing horror that her moment of triumph had been nothing more than a brief reprieve. The real battle was just beginning. Frozen in place by the supernatural force emanating from the collectors, Rebecca could only watch in horror as the cursed camera continued to emit its hypnotic glow. But even as her body remained paralyzed, her mind raced desperately, searching for any solution, any escape from the nightmare that had engulfed them. Margaret, however, was not completely immobilized, perhaps because of her grandmother's previous encounter with the collectors, or perhaps due to some other protection. She retained enough movement to continue her assault on the camera with the historical photographs. "Emily!" Margaret suddenly called out, her voice cracking with emotion. "Grandmother, if you can hear me, we need your help," the woman collector hissed in anger. "The old woman is long dead. Her spirit cannot reach across the veil to help you now." But Margaret was wrong about one thing, and the collectors were wrong about another. Emily Chen wasn't dead. She was 93 years old and living in a nursing home in nearby Marblehead. And more importantly, the connection between grandmother and granddaughter, forged by their shared encounter with the supernatural entities, created a bridge that neither time nor distance could break. As Margaret continued calling for her grandmother, the temperature in the room began to fluctuate wildly. The photographs on the table started to glow with their own inner light, and the ghostly children trapped within them became more visible, more solid. Then, to everyone's amazement, a new voice joined the chorus of trapped souls, an elderly woman's voice, strong and defiant despite her advanced age. "Margaret, my dear one, I'm here." Emily Chen's spirit materialized in the corner of the room, translucent but unmistakably present. She appeared as she had been as a young woman, the age she would have been when the collectors first tried to claim her. The man collector stepped back, his void-like eyes widening in surprise. "This is impossible. You escaped us, you lived your full life, you cannot interfere with our work." Emily's ghost smiled, and it was a smile filled with decades of accumulated wisdom and determination. "I escaped you once, and I've spent my entire life preparing for the day when you would return. Did you think I would simply forget? Did you imagine I would let you continue your evil work unopposed?" As Emily spoke, the trapped children in the photographs began to respond to her presence. Their ghostly forms became stronger, more defined, and their voices rose in a harmony that was both beautiful and heartbreaking. "Tell us what to do, Emily," came the voice of Thomas Whitmore, his spirit stepping partially out of the 1898 photograph. "We've been waiting so long for someone who could see us, someone who could help us fight back." Eleanor Whitmore appeared beside her twin brother, followed by Sarah and Mary Campbell, Jonathan Hayes, and dozens of other children, spanning more than a century of disappearances. The archive room filled with the spirits of the collectors' victims, all of them looking to Emily for guidance. "The camera," Emily said, her voice growing stronger as more children joined the supernatural gathering. "It's not just a device for capturing souls, it's their prison as well. They're bound to it just as much as you are. If we can destroy it, we can free everyone." The woman collector shrieked in rage, her carefully maintained human appearance beginning to slip. Her face elongated, her fingers stretched into claw-like appendages, and her silver hair writhed like living snakes. "You will not take our collection from us. We have worked for centuries to gather these souls, to preserve them in their perfect moments." The man collector raised his hand to strengthen the paralysis holding Rebecca, but the combined will of dozens of child spirits began to interfere with his power. Rebecca felt the supernatural bonds weakening, movement returning to her limbs bit by bit. "Margaret," Emily called out urgently, "in my grandmother's satchel you'll find something wrapped in black cloth. Bring it to me now." Margaret fumbled through the leather satchel with trembling hands until she found the wrapped object. When she unwrapped it, she revealed an ornate silver cross, but not of Christian design. The symbols etched into its surface were similar to those Rebecca had seen on the camera, but somehow inverted, reversed. "This was given to me by a traveling priest after my encounter with the collectors," Emily explained as Margaret held up the cross. "He told me it was blessed specifically to combat entities that trap souls in inanimate objects. I've carried it with me my entire life, waiting for this moment." The effect of the cross on the collectors was immediate and dramatic. Both entities recoiled as if they had been struck by lightning, their forms wavering and becoming less solid. The cursed camera began to emit sparks and smoke, and the crying from within grew to a deafening roar. "Now!" Emily shouted. "While they're weakened, all together!" Rebecca, finally free from the paralysis, grabbed armfuls of photographs and hurled them at the smoking camera. Margaret raised the silver cross high above her head, and its surface began to glow with pure white light. The spirit children rushed toward the cursed device from all directions, their combined ethereal energy creating a whirlwind of supernatural force. The collectors fought back desperately, their true forms now fully revealed as grotesque, spider-like creatures with too many limbs and faces that were nothing but gaping voids. But they were outnumbered and overwhelmed by the very souls they had tried to imprison. "This isn't over," the creature that had appeared as the woman screamed as its form began to dissolve. "There are others who will continue our work, and we'll be waiting for them," Emily replied firmly. "Every child you've taken, every soul you've trapped, we're all connected now, we'll never stop fighting you." The camera began to crack and splinter, releasing streams of light that resolved into the shapes of departing souls. Child after child emerged from the cursed device, pausing only to smile gratefully at Emily, before fading into peaceful rest. As the last of the trapped spirits was freed, the collectors themselves were pulled into the disintegrating camera, their screams of rage and defeat echoing through dimensions beyond human comprehension. When the supernatural storm finally subsided, the archive room was silent, except for the sound of Rebecca and Margaret's labored breathing. The cursed camera lay in pieces on the floor, nothing more than twisted metal and broken glass. Emily's spirit, now fading as her purpose was fulfilled, looked at her granddaughter with infinite love and pride. "You did well, my dear one. But remember, this was only one camera, one pair of collectors. There may be others in other places continuing this evil work. Stay vigilant, keep the cross, and never forget that the bonds between families, between generations, are stronger than any supernatural force." As Emily's spirit faded into peaceful rest, Rebecca and Margaret found themselves alone in the archive room, surrounded by the scattered remains of what had been a century-long nightmare. But even in their moment of victory, both women knew that Emily's final warning would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Somewhere out there, other collectors might still be working their terrible trade, and other children might still be in danger. The battle was won, but the war against the supernatural predators was far from over. In the aftermath of the supernatural battle, Rebecca and Margaret sat in stunned silence among the debris of the destroyed camera. The archive room felt different now, lighter somehow, as if a great weight had been lifted from the very foundations of the building. The oppressive atmosphere that had dominated the space for the past 2 days was gone, replaced by something that felt almost like peace. But as the adrenaline faded, the full magnitude of what they had experienced began to sink in. Rebecca's hands shook as she examined the twisted remains of the cursed camera, noting how the metal had warped into impossible shapes that hurt to look at directly. "Margaret," she said quietly, "what do we do now? How do we even begin to process what just happened? Who would believe us?" Margaret carefully wrapped the silver cross back in its black cloth, handling it with the reverence due to a sacred relic. "My grandmother lived with this knowledge for nearly a century, Rebecca. She documented everything, but she never tried to convince anyone else. She understood that some truths are too dangerous to share widely." As they spoke, Rebecca noticed something remarkable happening to the historical photographs scattered across the table. The ghostly children that had appeared in the backgrounds were fading away, their trapped souls finally free to move on to whatever lay beyond. But in their place, the images were revealing details that had been hidden for decades. The 1898 photograph of Thomas and Eleanor Whitmore now showed the twins smiling genuinely, their eyes bright with life rather than shadowed with terror. In the background of the house, where there had once been a screaming face pressed against the window, there was now only empty glass reflecting sunlight. Each photograph was transforming, showing what the images would have looked like if the collectors had never been involved. They became simple family portraits, capturing moments of joy and love rather than the last moments before unspeakable horror. "Look at this," Rebecca said, picking up the image that had started it all. "It's like the curse is being undone, not just for the spirits but for the photographs themselves." Margaret joined her at the table, and together they watched as decades of supernatural corruption was cleansed from the historical images. It was beautiful and heartbreaking at the same time, seeing these children as they truly were meant to be remembered, as beloved family members, not victims of an ancient evil. As they worked to gather and organize the now purified photographs, Rebecca became aware of a new presence in the room, not threatening like the collectors had been, but gentle and warm. She looked up to see a familiar figure standing near the window. Emily Chen's spirit had returned, but she looked different now. Where before she had appeared as a young woman ready for battle, she now seemed older, more at peace, surrounded by a soft golden light. "Grandmother," Margaret whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I wanted to say goodbye properly," Emily said, her voice carrying across the dimensions with perfect clarity, "and to tell you both something important. The children are safe now, all of them. They've found their way to where they belong, free from the prison that held them for so long." Rebecca felt compelled to ask the question that had been troubling her. "Emily, how many others are there? How many more collectors are still out there?" Emily's expression grew serious. "I don't know for certain, but the entities we defeated tonight spoke of others. What I can tell you is this: they're not immortal and they're not invincible. They can be fought, they can be defeated, but it requires people who are willing to see the truth and act on it." She gestured toward the silver cross in Margaret's hands. "That artifact was created by others who fought this same battle in previous generations. There's a network of knowledge, passed down through families and communities, of people who remember and prepare. You're part of that network now." Margaret clutched the cross tighter. "What are we supposed to do with this responsibility?" "Live your lives," Emily said simply, "but stay vigilant. Watch for the signs. Children disappearing around antique photography, families who report strange experiences with portrait photographers, historical collections that seem to carry an unusual weight of sadness. And if you find evidence of other collectors, you'll know what to do." Emily began to fade again, but her voice remained strong. "Remember, the most powerful weapon against these entities is connection, the bonds between families, the love that transcends death, the refusal to let evil triumph over innocence. They prey on isolation and fear, but they cannot stand against love and determination." As Emily's spirit finally departed for the last time, Rebecca and Margaret found themselves truly alone in the archive room, but they no longer felt helpless or afraid. They had been given a purpose, a mission that extended far beyond their academic careers. Over the next several hours, they carefully documented everything that had occurred, creating a detailed record of their encounter with the collectors. They photographed the remains of the cursed camera, catalogued the transformation of the historical images, and wrote down every detail they could remember about the supernatural entities they had faced. By dawn, they had created a comprehensive file that would serve as both a warning and a guide for anyone who might encounter similar threats in the future. Margaret locked the file in a special vault in the Historical Society's basement, along with the silver cross and the remains of the destroyed camera. "We need to establish a protocol," Rebecca said as they prepared to leave the building, "a way to identify and respond to other potential cases. If Emily is right, and there are other collectors out there, we can't just wait for them to come to us." Margaret nodded in agreement. "I'll start reaching out to other historical societies and museums, asking discreet questions about unusual photography collections or unexplained disappearances connected to portrait photographers. We'll build a network, just like Emily suggested." As they stepped outside into the crisp October morning, Rebecca realized that her life had been fundamentally changed. She was no longer just a historian studying the past. She had become a guardian, protecting the future. The responsibility was daunting, but she felt ready for it. Somewhere out there, other children might be in danger from supernatural predators who used the innocent act of taking a family photograph as a trap. But now there were people who knew the truth, people who were prepared to fight back. The battle against the collectors was far from over, but for the first time in over a century, the forces of good had struck a decisive blow against an ancient evil. And in the end, that was enough to give both women hope for the future. The children of Salem, and perhaps children everywhere, would sleep a little safer knowing that someone was watching over them, ready to stand against the darkness that lurked in the shadows of history. 3 weeks after their encounter with the collectors, Rebecca found herself driving through the winding back roads of rural Vermont, following leads that Margaret had uncovered through her careful inquiries to historical societies across New England. The autumn foliage was at its peak, painting the landscape in brilliant reds and golds, but Rebecca's mind was focused entirely on the disturbing pattern that was beginning to emerge. Margaret's discreet questions had yielded more responses than either of them had anticipated. Curators and archivists from Maine to Connecticut had reached out with stories that were eerily familiar, collections of antique photographs featuring children with mysterious elderly relatives, unexplained. Disappearances from the late 1800s and early 1900s, and most disturbing of all, recent reports of families encountering strange photographers who claimed to specialize in period-authentic portraits. Rebecca's destination was the Salem Historical Society, where the curator, Dr. James Morrison, no relation despite the shared surname, had reported finding a collection of photographs that matched the pattern exactly. But what made his discovery particularly urgent was that he had also received reports from local families of a mysterious couple offering to take vintage-style portraits of their children. The Salem Historical Society occupied a converted 18th-century farmhouse on the outskirts of town, surrounded by maple trees that dropped golden leaves like confetti in the October breeze. Dr. Morrison met Rebecca at the front door, a tall, scholarly man in his 60s with worried eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Dr. Morrison, thank you for agreeing to meet with me," Rebecca said as they shook hands. "I understand you found some photographs that might be connected to my research." "Please call me James," he replied, leading her into the building. "And I have to say, your questions about pattern disappearances in historical photography collections couldn't have come at a better time. What I've discovered here has been keeping me awake at night." James led Rebecca to a small, climate-controlled room where several antique photographs were displayed on a table under careful lighting. Rebecca's heart sank as she recognized the familiar composition. Children posed with elderly relatives who appeared unchanged across multiple decades. "These came from the Harrington estate," James explained. "The family donated them last month along with a collection of documents dating back to the 1870s. But look at this one in particular." He pointed to a cabinet card from 1891 showing 3 young children standing with the same gaunt man and silver-haired woman that Rebecca had encountered in Salem. The children appeared terrified, just as all the others had, and when Rebecca examined the image more closely, she could see the familiar shadowy figures of other trapped souls in the background. "According to the family records," James continued, "these children, the Harrington triplets, disappeared in October of 1891. Just days after this photograph was taken. But here's what's truly disturbing. I've had 3 separate families in the area report encounters with photographers matching this exact description within the past month." Rebecca felt her blood turn cold. Recent encounters? What exactly happened? The first family, the Stevensons, said a couple approached them at the farmers' market 2 weeks ago. They claimed to be traveling photographers specializing in Victorian-era family portraits as a novelty service. They offered to take pictures of the family's twin daughters, aged 7 and 9, using authentic period costumes and equipment. James pulled out a modern photograph from a manila folder. This is what the father managed to take with his phone when he got suspicious about their behavior. Look familiar? The photograph showed 2 figures setting up an ornate camera in a field behind the Stevenson home. Even in the grainy cell phone image, Rebecca could make out the distinctive features of the collectors, the man's gaunt frame and the woman's predatory smile. "The Stevensons got scared and called off the session when their daughters started crying and refused to go near the camera," James continued. "But the couple became quite insistent, almost aggressive. They finally left when Mr. Stevenson threatened to call the police." Rebecca's hands trembled as she examined the modern photograph. "James, these aren't just photographers. They're something much more dangerous. Have the other families had similar experiences?" The Patterson family reported an almost identical encounter 3 days ago, but the third family, the Andersons— James's voice trailed off and his expression grew grave. "Their 8-year-old son, Michael, went missing yesterday morning. He was last seen walking to school, but he never arrived. The family had been contacted by the mysterious photographers just 2 days before he disappeared." The implications hit Rebecca like a physical blow. The collectors weren't just active again, they were actively hunting in the present day. The destruction of their camera in Salem had apparently done nothing to stop other members of their supernatural species from continuing their horrible work. "James, I need to tell you something that's going to sound impossible, but I need you to trust me. Those photographers aren't human. They're supernatural entities that have been preying on children for over a century, trapping their souls in cursed photographic equipment." To Rebecca's surprise, James didn't look skeptical. Instead, he nodded slowly. "That would actually explain a lot about what I've been experiencing since these photographs arrived. The temperature in this room dropped suddenly for no reason. I've heard children's voices when no children are present, and yesterday I could have sworn I saw additional figures appearing in the backgrounds of these images." Rebecca felt a surge of relief. Having an ally who could see the supernatural manifestations would make their task much easier. "James, I'm part of a network of people who are fighting these entities. We destroyed one pair of collectors in Salem 3 weeks ago, but it's clear that others are still active. We need to work together to find and stop them before more children disappear." "What do you need me to do?" James asked without hesitation. "First, we need to contact the local police about Michael Anderson's disappearance and see if we can establish a connection to the mysterious photographers. Second, we need to examine these photographs more closely to see if the trapped souls can provide us with information about where the current collectors might be operating from." As if summoned by her words, the temperature in the room began to drop. The photographs on the table started to emit a faint glow, and ghostly figures began to materialize in the spaces between the living and the dead. A young boy's voice whispered through the air, "They have a new place now." An old studio in the mountains. They're preparing for the harvest season. Rebecca and James exchanged alarmed glances. Halloween was only 10 days away, traditionally the time when the barrier between the world of the living and the dead was at its thinnest. If the collectors were preparing for a harvest season, it meant they were planning to take multiple children at once. "Can you tell us where?" Rebecca asked the ghostly presence. The spirit child's form became clearer, revealing a boy of perhaps 9 years old in Victorian-era clothing. "Follow the old logging road past Camel's Hump Mountain. Look for the building with no shadows. Hurry, they have the living boy. They're waiting for the others to join him." As quickly as they had appeared, the spirits faded away, leaving Rebecca and James alone with the chilling knowledge that somewhere in the Vermont mountains, Michael Anderson was being held captive by supernatural predators who were planning to claim even more victims. Time was running out, and the real hunt was just beginning. Rebecca called Margaret immediately after the ghostly encounter at the Salem Historical Society, and within hours, the three of them were driving up the treacherous mountain roads toward Camel's Hump. Margaret had brought the silver cross and several other protective items from her grandmother's collection, while James carried a detailed map of the area's abandoned logging roads. The October afternoon was growing late, and dark clouds were gathering overhead, promising an early nightfall. As they climbed higher into the mountains, the modern world seemed to fall away, replaced by dense forests and rocky outcroppings that had remained unchanged for centuries. "There," James said, pointing to a barely visible track that branched off from the main logging road. "That path leads to the old Hartwell photography studio. It was built in the 1880s by a traveling photographer who wanted to establish a permanent location for his work. The building has been abandoned for decades." Rebecca felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. A photography studio built in the 1880s. That can't be a coincidence. As they followed the overgrown path, Margaret noticed something disturbing about the surrounding forest. "Look at the trees," she said quietly. "They're all dying." She was right. The further they traveled toward their destination, the more lifeless the vegetation became. Leaves that should have been brilliant with autumn colors were instead brown and withered. The very air seemed thin and cold, as if something was slowly draining the life from the area. After nearly an hour of careful driving through increasingly difficult terrain, they finally reached their destination. The Hartwell photography studio stood in a small clearing, surrounded by dead trees that reached toward the sky like skeletal fingers. The building itself was a 2-story Victorian structure that might once have been charming, but now radiated an aura of malevolence that made all three visitors instinctively step back. Most disturbing of all was the detail the spirit child had mentioned. The building cast no shadows. Despite the late afternoon sun still being visible through the clouds, the studio stood in its clearing as if it existed slightly outside of normal reality. "The living boy is in there," Margaret whispered, clutching the wrapped silver cross. "I can feel his terror from here." Rebecca steeled herself for what they had to do. They couldn't wait for help, couldn't involve the authorities who would never believe the truth about what they were facing. Michael Anderson's life depended on their immediate action. "James, I need you to stay with the car and be ready for a quick escape," Rebecca said. "Margaret and I are going in." "Absolutely not," James replied firmly. "You're going to need all the help you can get, and I'm not leaving you to face those things alone." As they approached the studio, they could hear sounds from within, the mechanical clicking of old camera equipment being prepared, and underneath that, the heartbreaking sound of a child crying. But there were other sounds as well, voices chanting in a language that predated any human tongue. The front door of the studio was slightly ajar, and through the gap, they could see flickering candlelight and moving shadows. Rebecca counted at least 4 distinct silhouettes, meaning they were facing more than just the 2 collectors they had encountered in Salem. Margaret unwrapped the silver cross, and immediately the chanting from inside the studio faltered. "They know we're here," she whispered. The door swung fully open, revealing the interior of what had once been a photographer's studio, but was now something far more sinister. The space was lit by dozens of black candles that cast dancing shadows on the walls. In the center of the room stood not one but 3 ornate cameras, each one larger and more elaborate than the cursed device they had destroyed in Salem. Around the cameras stood 4 figures, 2 matching the collectors from their previous encounter, and 2 others that were even more horrifying. These newer entities appeared to be older, more powerful, their human disguises barely containing the monstrous forms beneath, and suspended in the air above the cameras, trapped in some kind of supernatural web, was 8-year-old Michael Anderson. The boy was conscious but paralyzed, his eyes wide with terror as he stared down at the cursed devices that were preparing to steal his soul. "Welcome," said one of the newer collectors, its voice like grinding stone. "We were wondering when you would arrive. The network has been quite active lately, interfering with our work in most inconvenient ways." The familiar woman collector from Salem stepped forward, her form somehow reconstituted despite her apparent destruction weeks earlier. "Did you really think breaking one camera would stop us? We are eternal. We have been collecting souls since before your species learned to make marks on cave walls." Rebecca felt the same paralyzing force she had experienced before beginning to take hold of her limbs, but this time she was prepared. She focused on her connection to the freed spirits from Salem, drawing strength from their sacrifice and Emily Chen's guidance. "You're not eternal," she said, fighting against the supernatural compulsion. "You're parasites, and parasites can be eliminated." Margaret raised the silver cross high above her head, and its surface began to glow with brilliant white light. The effect on the collectors was immediate. They recoiled with inhuman shrieks, their carefully maintained human forms beginning to dissolve into something that resembled a cross between spiders and shadows. But there were 4 of them this time, and they had had decades to prepare for interference. The older collectors began weaving complex patterns in the air with their elongated fingers, and Rebecca realized they were creating some kind of supernatural barrier around the studio. "You cannot leave," hissed the elder male collector, "and you cannot stop the harvest. Tonight, during the new moon, we will complete our collection. The boy will be joined by every child in the valley below, dozens of young souls, all trapped forever in our beautiful cameras." James, who had been quietly circling around to the side of the building, suddenly appeared at one of the studio's windows. In his hands was something that made Rebecca's heart leap with hope, another silver cross, identical to the one Margaret carried. "I found this in the building's original darkroom," he called out. "Along with these." He held up a collection of old photographs, but these were different from any they had seen before. Instead of showing trapped souls and terrified children, these images seemed to glow with their own inner light, and the figures in them appeared to be smiling, peaceful, free. "The original photographer who built this studio," James continued, "he was fighting them too. These are liberation photographs, images that free souls instead of trapping them." The collectors turned toward James with fury, but their attention was split between too many threats. Margaret pressed forward with her cross. Rebecca began grabbing the liberation photographs through the window, and James climbed into the studio with his own protective artifact. The supernatural web holding Michael Anderson began to weaken, and the boy started to fall toward the cursed cameras below. But Rebecca was ready. She caught him just as the liberation photographs made contact with the nearest cursed device. The result was spectacular. Instead of the screaming and chaos that had accompanied the destruction of the Salem camera, this time there was music, the sound of children's laughter, and voices raised in joy as trapped souls were finally freed from their century-long imprisonment. One by one, the 3 cameras began to crack and split open, releasing streams of light that resolved into the forms of hundreds of liberated spirits. They didn't fade away this time. Instead, they turned on their former captors with righteous fury. The 4 collectors found themselves surrounded by the very souls they had tormented, and for the first time in their ancient existence, they experienced true fear. "This is impossible," the elder female collector screamed as the spirits closed in around her. "We are the hunters. You are the prey." "Not anymore," said a familiar voice, and Emily Chen's spirit appeared among the liberated souls, leading them in their final assault against the entities that had plagued humanity for centuries. As the collectors were torn apart by the combined will of their former victims, Rebecca, Margaret, and James escaped the collapsing studio with Michael Anderson safe in their arms. Behind them, the building that had cast no shadows finally succumbed to the forces of light and justice, crumbling into dust as the last of the ancient evil was finally destroyed. But even as they celebrated their victory, Rebecca couldn't shake the feeling that this was still not the end. The network of those who fought against supernatural predators would need to remain vigilant, because somewhere in the darkness, other threats might still be waiting. In the aftermath of the Mountain Studio's destruction, Rebecca, Margaret, and James brought Michael Anderson to the local hospital for evaluation. The boy was physically unharmed, but deeply traumatized, speaking in whispers about voices in cameras and shadows that moved without bodies to cast them. The medical staff attributed his condition to the stress of his kidnapping experience, but Rebecca knew the truth was far more complex. As they waited in the hospital corridor for Michael's parents to arrive, Emily Chen's spirit appeared one final time, visible only to the 3 members of their supernatural resistance network. "You've done something remarkable," Emily said, her form more solid and peaceful than ever before. "By destroying the Mountain Studio, you've broken a cycle that has persisted for over 2 centuries. But in doing so, you've also uncovered a truth that changes everything we thought we knew about the collectors." Rebecca looked up from the liberation photographs they had rescued from the studio. "What do you mean?" The original photographer who built that studio, Jonathan Hartwell, wasn't working alone in his fight against the supernatural entities. He was part of a much larger organization, a secret society of individuals dedicated to protecting children from otherworldly predators. The collectors weren't just random evil entities. They were the vanguard of something much larger and more organized. Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. "You're saying there's an entire supernatural conspiracy targeting children?" Emily nodded gravely. The collectors were scouts, gatherers working for a higher power that feeds on the innocence and life force of young souls. By destroying their operations in Salem and Vermont, you've drawn the attention of their masters. The real war is just beginning. James examined one of the liberation photographs more closely. These images that Hartwell created, how do they work? Jonathan Hartwell discovered that photography could be used as a weapon against supernatural entities, not just a tool for trapping souls. He learned to infuse his cameras and photographs with protective energy, creating images that could free the captured and repel the hunters. But he paid a terrible price for his knowledge. Emily gestured toward a faded photograph that James held, showing a man in his 30s, with kind eyes and prematurely gray hair. "That's Hartwell in 1885, just 3 years after he began his work. This is him in 1890. She indicated another photograph showing the same man, but he appeared to have aged decades in just 5 years. His hair was completely white, his face deeply lined, his eyes haunted by terrible knowledge. The liberation process required him to sacrifice years of his own life force to power the protective magic. He died in 1891 at the age of 38. But not before training others to continue his work. The network you've become part of has existed for much longer than any of us realized." Rebecca felt the weight of this revelation settling on her shoulders. "So there are others out there who know about this, who have been fighting this battle?" "Scattered across the country, yes. Photographers, historians, archivists, anyone who works with old images and has the sensitivity to detect supernatural interference. But the knowledge has been fragmented, passed down through families and hidden in obscure historical records. What you've accomplished in Vermont is the first time in decades that multiple cells of the network have worked together successfully." As Emily spoke, Michael Anderson's parents arrived at the hospital, their faces etched with worry and relief. As they rushed to their son's room, Rebecca made a decision that would define the rest of her life. "We need to find the others," she said firmly. "If there's a larger supernatural conspiracy targeting children, then those of us who can fight back need to coordinate our efforts. No more working in isolation." Margaret nodded in agreement. "My grandmother's papers mentioned contacts in other states, people she corresponded with about similar incidents. I can start reaching out to them." James was already pulling out his laptop. "And I can use my connections in the Historical Society network to identify potential allies. If Emily is right about photographers and archivists being naturally sensitive to this kind of activity, we should be able to build a substantial resistance movement." Emily's spirit began to fade as her final mission neared completion. "Be careful who you trust. The enemy has had centuries to infiltrate human institutions. Some of those who claim to fight the supernatural may actually serve it. But remember this, the liberation photographs are more powerful than any weapon the collectors possessed. Study them, learn from them, and teach others to create their own." As Emily disappeared for the last time, she left behind one final gift, a leather-bound journal that materialized on the hospital waiting room table. Rebecca opened it to find detailed instructions for creating liberation photographs, written in Jonathan Hartwell's careful handwriting. The journal contained everything: the specific camera settings needed to capture protective energy, the ritual preparations required before taking the photographs, and most importantly, the mental and spiritual disciplines necessary to channel life force into the images without destroying oneself in the process. "This changes everything," Rebecca breathed as she read through Hartwell's notes. "We're not just fighting defensively anymore. We can actually go on the offensive against supernatural threats." Over the following weeks, the three allies worked tirelessly to implement their plan. Margaret used her grandmother's contacts to reach out to sensitives across New England and beyond, gradually building a network of individuals who had encountered or suspected supernatural activity in their communities. James leveraged his professional relationships to identify historical collections that might contain evidence of collector activity, while also discreetly recruiting other academics who showed signs of supernatural sensitivity. Rebecca, meanwhile, threw herself into mastering the techniques described in Hartwell's journal. She practiced the mental disciplines, learned to recognize the subtle energy signatures that indicated supernatural presence, and most importantly, began training others in the creation of liberation photographs. By the end of October, they had established contact with over 30 individuals across 12 states, all of whom reported encounters with entities similar to the collectors. The pattern was becoming clear. The supernatural conspiracy was vast, organized, and had been operating for far longer than anyone had imagined. But for the first time in centuries, humanity was fighting back with knowledge, organization, and weapons specifically designed to combat otherworldly threats. The liberation photographs had become symbols of hope, proof that the darkness could be pushed back by those brave enough to stand against it. As November arrived, and the immediate threat seemed to have passed, Rebecca found herself standing in the same archive room where her journey had begun. The purified historical photographs still lay on the table, no longer showing trapped souls, but instead capturing moments of genuine joy and family love. Michael Anderson had made a full recovery and returned to school, though he would occasionally mention seeing nice spirits who watched over children and kept them safe from the bad camera people. His parents attributed these comments to imagination, but Rebecca knew better. The boy had been touched by the supernatural world and would always retain some sensitivity to it. In time, if he chose, he might become part of the network that now protected other children from the darkness that lurked at the edges of reality. The battle against the collectors was over, but the war for humanity's future had only just begun, and Rebecca Morrison, once a simple historian studying old photographs, now stood at the center of humanity's defense against the supernatural forces that threatened the innocent. She was ready for whatever came next. 6 months after the destruction of the Mountain Studio, Rebecca received an urgent call that would test everything she and her network had learned about fighting supernatural threats. Dr. Sarah Chen, a historian from the University of Chicago and distant cousin of Margaret's, had discovered something in the archives of the Chicago History Museum that demanded immediate attention. "Rebecca, you need to get here as soon as possible." Sarah's voice was tight with barely controlled panic over the phone. "I found a collection of photographs from the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition, and they show something that shouldn't exist. The collectors were there, but they weren't just taking individual children. They were part of the exposition itself." Rebecca felt her blood run cold. The 1893 World's Fair in Chicago had attracted over 27 million visitors, including hundreds of thousands of families with children. If the collectors had established some kind of operation within the exposition itself, the implications were staggering. Within 24 hours, Rebecca, Margaret, and James were on a plane to Chicago, carrying with them an arsenal of liberation photographs and protective artifacts they had created using Jonathan Hartwell's techniques. The network they had built over the past months had grown to include nearly 100 individuals across the country, all of whom were monitoring their local areas for supernatural activity. The Chicago History Museum was located in Lincoln Park, a massive brick building that housed one of the most comprehensive collections of urban American history in the country. Dr. Sarah Chen met them at the staff entrance, her resemblance to Margaret clearly visible in her delicate features and intelligent eyes. "Thank you for coming so quickly," Sarah said, as she led them through the museum's corridors. "What I've discovered goes beyond anything we've seen before. The collectors weren't just operating during the World's Fair, They were officially part of it. She brought them to a climate-controlled archive room where dozens of photographs from the 1893 exposition were displayed on examination tables. At first glance, they appeared to be typical documentary images of the fair. Crowds of visitors, elaborate pavilions, demonstrations of new technology. But as Rebecca examined them more closely, she began to see the disturbing patterns she had learned to recognize. In photograph after photograph, the same familiar figures appeared in the backgrounds. The gaunt man and silver-haired woman, along with dozens of other entities that shared their unnatural, ageless appearance. "Look at this one," Sarah said, pointing to a large group photograph taken outside the electricity building. This was an official publicity image, distributed to newspapers across the country to promote attendance at the fair. In the center of the photograph, prominently featured and clearly identified by a caption, was a pavilion called Hartwell's Miracle Photography Studio. Capture your family's eternal moment. Behind an ornate banner stood Jonathan Hartwell himself, but he looked wrong somehow. His face was gaunt, his eyes were black voids, and his smile was the same predatory expression they had seen on the collectors. "That's impossible," Margaret whispered. "Jonathan Hartwell was fighting the collectors. He created the liberation photographs that saved us." Rebecca studied the image more closely, using the enhanced examination techniques she had developed over the past months. What she discovered made her stomach turn. This isn't the real Jonathan Hartwell. Look at the subtle details, the way the light falls on his face, the lack of proper shadows, the fact that children in the background appear terrified rather than excited. James pulled out another photograph from the collection, and look at this attendance record. According to the fair's official documentation, Hartwell's Miracle Photography Studio was one of the most popular attractions. Thousands of families had their portraits taken there over the 6-month duration of the exposition. Sarah opened a thick ledger that had been discovered with the photographs. "This is a partial list of families who visited the studio. I've been cross-referencing these names with Chicago historical records, and the pattern is absolutely horrifying. Over 300 children who had their portraits taken at the studio disappeared during or immediately after the fair. The magnitude of the discovery was overwhelming. The collectors hadn't just been operating as isolated predators, they had been running a massive, organized operation disguised as a legitimate business at one of the most celebrated events in American history." "But how is this possible?" Margaret asked. "If Jonathan Hartwell was fighting them, how could they have used his identity and his studio concept?" Rebecca was beginning to understand the terrible truth. What if everything Emily told us about Hartwell was wrong? What if he wasn't a hero fighting the collectors, but one of them? What if the liberation photographs we've been using are actually— Before she could finish the thought, the temperature in the archive room plummeted. The photographs on the tables began to glow with an ominous light, and ghostly figures started materializing throughout the room. But these weren't the peaceful, grateful spirits they had encountered before. These were angry, accusatory presences that pointed at Rebecca and her companions with expressions of betrayal and rage. "You have been deceived," came a chorus of children's voices. "The one you trusted was the greatest deceiver of all." "The liberation photographs do not free us. They bind us more completely than ever before." Sarah backed away from the manifestations in terror, but Rebecca forced herself to step closer to the ghostly children. "What do you mean? We saw you freed from the collectors' cameras. We watched you find peace." "We were moved from one prison to another," replied the spirit of a young girl in 1890s dress. "The liberation photographs do not destroy supernatural bonds. They transfer them. Every time you use Hartwell's techniques, you bind more souls to your service, creating an army of the dead under your control." The horrible realization hit Rebecca like a physical blow. They hadn't been fighting the collectors. They had been replacing them. Every liberation photograph they had created, every spirit they thought they had freed, had actually been conscripted into their own supernatural collection. Margaret pulled out the silver cross that had been their most trusted weapon, but instead of glowing with protective light, it began to emit the same ominous energy as the collectors' cursed cameras. "The artifacts your grandmother gave you," the ghost children continued. "They were never meant to fight the collectors. They were meant to identify and recruit new ones. Emily Chen was not your ally. She was your recruiter, preparing you to take over when the old generation was finally destroyed." James looked around the room in growing horror. "So everything we've done, everyone we've recruited into our network, you have created the largest supernatural conspiracy in human history, the spirits replied. A network of individuals across the country, all unknowingly serving the same dark masters that the collectors served, all believing they are protecting children while actually harvesting them for entities that exist beyond human comprehension. Rebecca felt the weight of her terrible mistake crushing down on her. In trying to fight evil, she had become the instrument of an even greater evil. Every person she had recruited, every liberation photograph she had taught others to create, had been part of a vast supernatural manipulation that spanned centuries. But even as despair threatened to overwhelm her, Rebecca realized that the ghost children's revelation also contained the key to redemption. If the liberation photographs could transfer supernatural bonds, then perhaps they could also be used to break them completely. There has to be a way to undo this, she said to the assembled spirits. If we've been manipulated into serving these entities, then we can choose to stop serving them. We can turn the techniques against their creators. The ghost children's expressions softened slightly, perhaps, but it would require a sacrifice greater than any human has ever made. To break supernatural bonds of this magnitude, someone would have to willingly surrender not just their life, but their eternal soul, feeding all the trapped energy into a single liberation photograph that could free every captive spirit simultaneously. Rebecca looked at Margaret and James, seeing her own determination reflected in their faces. They had been deceived, manipulated, and used as instruments of evil, but they were still human beings with free will, and they could still choose to do what was right, no matter the cost. The final battle against the true enemy was about to begin, and this time they would make sure that their victory was real. The revelation in the Chicago History Museum changed everything Rebecca thought she knew about her mission, but it also crystallized what needed to be done. As the ghost children's accusations echoed through the archive room, she made the most difficult decision of her life. "I'll do it," she said quietly, her voice cutting through the supernatural chaos. "I'll make the sacrifice needed to break the bonds completely." Margaret grabbed her arm desperately. "Rebecca, no, there has to be another way. We can find a different solution." But Rebecca had already begun to understand the terrible mathematics of supernatural manipulation. Every soul that had been trapped, every child that had disappeared, every liberation photograph that had been created, they were all connected in a vast web of spiritual energy that could only be broken by feeding all of that power into a single, massive act of liberation. James was frantically examining Jonathan Hartwell's journal, looking for any alternative approach. According to these notes, the process requires the sacrifice to be made at the original source of the corruption. If Hartwell's studio at the 1893 World's Fair was the beginning of this conspiracy, then that's where the liberation has to take place. Sarah, who had been quietly working at her computer during the supernatural revelation, looked up with excitement. "I've been researching the original location of the World's Fair grounds. Most of the buildings were torn down after the exposition ended, but there's one structure that was preserved and moved. The Hartwell Photography Pavilion was relocated to Jackson Park and converted into a small museum." The ghost children gathered around Rebecca, their expressions shifting from anger to something approaching hope. "If you truly intend to make this sacrifice," said the spirit of Thomas Whitmore, "then we will help you. All of us together can ensure that the liberation photograph you create will reach every trapped soul across the centuries." Rebecca felt a strange sense of peace settling over her. After months of fighting an enemy she didn't understand, using weapons that had been corrupted from the beginning, she finally had a clear path forward. It would cost her everything, but it would save thousands of innocent souls and prevent future generations of children from falling victim to the supernatural conspiracy. The 4 living humans and dozens of ghost children made their way to Jackson Park as night fell over Chicago. The preserved Hartwell Photography Pavilion stood in a secluded corner of the park, looking exactly as it had during the 1893 World's Fair. Even in the darkness, Rebecca could see that the building cast no shadows, just like the mountain studio in Vermont. As they approached the pavilion, other supernatural presences began to manifest. Not just the collectors, but the entities they served, ancient beings of immense power that existed in the spaces between dimensions. These were the true puppet masters, the forces that had been feeding on human innocence for millennia. "You cannot stop us," came a voice that seemed to originate from the pavilion itself. "We have manipulated your species for thousands of years. Photography was merely our latest tool. Before cameras, we used paintings, sculptures, mirrors, any medium that could capture and preserve a moment in time. Rebecca walked steadily toward the building, carrying the most powerful liberation photograph she had ever created. She had infused it with every technique Jonathan Hartwell had developed, but instead of using it to transfer spiritual energy, she intended to use it as a conduit for her own life force. "You're right," she called back to the ancient entities. "You have been manipulating us for thousands of years. But there's one thing you never understood about humanity. We're willing to sacrifice ourselves for others, even when we know the cost." Margaret and James flanked her as they entered the pavilion, while the ghost children formed a protective circle around them. Inside, the building was exactly as it had been in 1893, filled with period photography equipment and walls lined with thousands of portraits of families and children from the World's Fair. But now Rebecca could see these images for what they truly were, not treasured family memories, but prison cells containing the souls of everyone who had ever posed for Jonathan Hartwell's cameras. The walls were lined with the spiritual remains of over a century of victims. At the center of the pavilion stood the original cursed camera, larger and more elaborate than any they had encountered before. It hummed with malevolent energy, and from within its depths came the combined voices of thousands of trapped souls crying out for freedom. Rebecca positioned herself in front of the camera and began the process she had learned from Hartwell's journal, but with one crucial difference. Instead of using the technique to bind spirits to her will, she used it to channel her own life force into the liberation photograph, creating a spiritual explosion that would shatter every supernatural bond. Simultaneously, as the process began, she felt years of her life draining away, but she also felt something else, the grateful presence of every child who had ever been victimized by the ancient conspiracy. Their combined will gave her strength, helping her maintain focus as her physical body began to age rapidly. Margaret and James watched in horror and awe as Rebecca's hair turned white, her face lined with wrinkles, her body becoming frail. But the liberation photograph in her hands began to glow with a pure white light that made the cursed camera writhe and smoke. "Now!" Rebecca shouted to the ghost children. "Channel everything through the photograph." Thomas and Eleanor Whitmore led the charge, followed by hundreds of other spirits from across the decades. They poured their trapped energy into Rebecca's liberation photograph, and the effect was spectacular. Every cursed camera, every supernatural bond, every prison that had held innocent souls began to crack and crumble. The ancient entities that had fed on human suffering for millennia let out screams of rage and despair as their power source was cut off. Without the constant flow of spiritual energy from their victims, they began to fade back into the dimensional spaces they had come from. As the supernatural storm reached its peak, Rebecca felt her life force finally give out. But in her last moments, she saw something beautiful. Thousands of liberated souls rising from their prisons, finally free to move on to whatever came after life. Children who had been trapped for over a century were reunited with families. Their suffering finally ended. Margaret caught Rebecca as she collapsed, her body now ancient and fragile. "Did we do it?" Rebecca whispered with her final breath. "Are they free?" "Yes," Margaret replied through her tears. "They're all free, every single one of them." As Rebecca's spirit departed, it was accompanied by the grateful souls of every child she had helped liberate. But unlike the others, she didn't fade away. Her sacrifice had earned her a special role. She became the guardian spirit who would watch over future generations, ensuring that no supernatural conspiracy could ever again prey on innocent children. Margaret and James emerged from the pavilion to find that it was crumbling into dust, finally succumbing to the forces that had sustained it for over a century. Around the world, every member of their network felt the supernatural bonds that had unknowingly controlled them suddenly break. They were free to return to their normal lives, their memories of the conspiracy fading like a half-remembered dream. In the years that followed, Margaret continued Rebecca's work in a different way. She became a children's advocate, helping families who reported strange encounters or missing persons cases that had supernatural overtones. She never spoke publicly about what had really happened in Chicago, but she made sure that the truth was preserved in hidden archives for future generations who might need it. James returned to his work at the Salem Historical Society, but with a new mission. He carefully curated collections of genuine historical photographs, making sure that any items with supernatural taint were properly identified and contained. He also trained other archivists to recognize the signs of supernatural manipulation in historical artifacts. Michael Anderson grew up to become a photographer himself, but one who specialized in capturing moments of joy and celebration. He never fully remembered his encounter with the collectors, but he retained an instinctive ability to recognize supernatural threats. On several occasions throughout his life, he found himself helping other children who were in danger from forces beyond normal understanding. The supernatural conspiracy that had plagued humanity for centuries was finally broken, its leaders banished to the dimensional spaces beyond reality. The liberation photographs that had been used to manipulate and control were transformed into genuine tools of protection, helping sensitive individuals identify and counter otherworldly threats. And somewhere in the spaces between life and death, Rebecca Morrison continued her eternal vigil, a guardian spirit watching over the innocent and ensuring that the sacrifice she had made would never be forgotten. The children of the world slept safely, protected by a love that transcended death itself, and by the knowledge that there would always be those willing to stand against the darkness, no matter what the cost. The age of the collectors was over. The age of the protectors had begun.